Corla, I think it is important to put the amendments in the context of the backdrop to the legislation itself and what the stated objectives of what the Minister is trying to address and whether they have actually been addressed, because obviously we're dealing with a scenario where some defined benefit schemes have run into difficulties, and as it's constituted at the moment, many of the active members and indeed deferred members in some instances are left with a very serious hit, whereas up to now those who were already on a pension had a certain amount of protection. And what this bill proposes to do is alter that priority arrangement. Now, I think we have to be very careful in that, because while obviously there is a serious issue which needs to be addressed for the active and deferred members of schemes, no question about that, in actual fact, looking at how this impacts on the pensioners themselves needs to be carefully factored in. Now, the bill does deal with scenarios where double insolvency, where the company is in financial difficulties and the pension scheme is in financial difficulties, and guarantees certain benefits in that scenario. I think the area where the company is quite secure financially, but the pension scheme is potentially in difficulty, is an area which the bill doesn't address tightly enough. And the issue of employer responsibility is the key part of this legislation which needs to be tackled. And I know the Minister was sympathetic in committee to the points, but I don't think has accepted any amendments or any changes to the legislation which are actually necessary to bring that scenario about. And we again have to stress maybe some of the reasons why these amendments need to be taken on board. And I'm very much conscious of the situations that companies out there, like for example Aer Lingus, have a cash reserves of almost €1 billion and yet are refusing to invest adequately in a pension scheme which, based on the way in which they're actuarially calculated now, has been depleted a little bit precisely because of some of the antics of that company to begin with. And I don't think that it's good enough that a company like that can walk away and leave either pensioners who are currently drawing their pension, active members, or indeed the state picking up the tab in that regard. And I think there's a statutory basis to what we're saying, but this Act leaves it too open. Up to now, employers have been using a certain loophole in this regard. They've looked at things like FRS 17 and so on, but that has been adjudicated by the Pensions Board to say that the accounting of the scheme as a defined contribution scheme doesn't negate any of the statutory obligations on the employer. The Minister is aware that there was a very important case in the Commercial Court last year with Aer Lingus, where that ruled that pensions were a contingent liability and that these issues, the debt was there. And what we're trying to do is really have that recognised in law. The way in which it is in Britain, we need even America, to be honest, which is a bit ironic that even people like George Bush implemented legislation which put the pension obligations of employers in law, and that's what we need to do here. Now, the Minister at committee said that the reason why she couldn't do this was that it might frighten off or result in some of these schemes shutting down. Now, we have to be clear about this. As it stands now, defined benefit schemes are not open for business. There are no new ones being created, and in actual fact, in many of the companies where they already exist, they have been shut down already to new applicants. And if you look at scenarios like the IASS scheme, which would have almost 15,000 members in it between the various categories, that has been closed to new applicants as a defined benefit scheme since 2008 and 2009. Because Aer Lingus have set up an Aer Lingus Ireland pension scheme, and the Dublin Airport Authority has set up a Dublin Airport Services Limited, and both of those operate as defined contribution schemes. So, if you like, the doomsday scenario that the Minister warned might happen if our legislation is here already. It is shut for business, and in actual fact, I think you could put a very good argument to say that if you put down strict guidelines and legal requirements on employers to not be allowed to walk away, but to face up to their responsibilities for these schemes, that in actual fact that would act as a deterrent to them shutting down the defined benefit schemes, because at the moment they can do it and don't have a liability. What we're seeking to do, that if they try and do that and the company is in good health financially, then they are penalised, or if they have to foot the bill for that. And I think that's very necessary, because if we don't factor that in, de facto what we're saying is that existing pensioners have to pay for that problem, and I don't think that's good enough, particularly when the majority of our pensioners across the state, including those who've contributed over a lifetime of working, in actual fact have a very modest pension in their retirement years. And it's not true to say that pensioners haven't already contributed. If you take a scenario like the airport schemes, and this legislation was to be passed, and the 10% cut was to be implemented, 95% of the pensioners in that scheme, which would have been considered an OK pension scheme, but 95% of them would come in the lower category and would be open to the 10% cut that's been proposed by the Minister in that criteria. That would save that pension scheme, or if you like, it would take from those pensioners €8 million per annum out of those pensioners' pockets. And I don't think that's good enough when you're dealing with companies that have a very fine balance sheet on their books. I think we have to take in the fact that pensioners have funded their schemes over a lifetime of work. They've already had reductions in pensions due to stamp duty, pension levy of 2.55%, another one scheduled for 2015. And many of these have had no post-retirement increases in the pension since April 2007, which in essence means, in terms of their purchasing power, they've been falling back anyway. And I think we have to say, in so many of these cases, the Minister made a point at committee that people were living longer, and this was the reason for the problems. I don't see that. There's a small element in that, but to be honest, it was much more policies by these companies that caused the problems, and they should have known. And that is in relation to some of the big schemes where they facilitated and financially, if you like, that they used reserves built up in the pension schemes and diverted those funds belonged to the pensioners who worked a lifetime to pay for them to incentivise early retirement or voluntary severance programmes, and therefore caused a certain problem in the scheme. Now, these employers, in many instances, gave workers no choice. Joining these pension schemes were a condition of your employment. And if the company has taken steps to break that contract, then in my view, they are liable. And if we don't accept that, then we're saying that pensioners or deferred or active members are responsible. And I don't think that that's good enough when you see workers who've given over a lifetime of work that the average employer-employee contribution will be over 10%, 15% of their income. It's more than enough, or would have been, to fund an adequate pension on their retirement. So I think for all of these reasons, employer responsibility has to be factored in. I think the amendments that we're moving is one way of doing it. I think in some of the discussions that are ongoing in some of the defined benefit schemes at the moment, compensation funds are being considered by employers, some amounts of money being invested in. We saw that in the ESB, similarly in the IASS scheme at the moment, but these aren't legislated for in the bill, and I think that they need to be, to give some security and to again put the onus on the employer in that regard.